The one thing live action One Piece will never overcome is time and money, which is actually two things, but just stick with me here. Money is used to buy time. We have this amount of money which can produce this amount of episodes. But live action One Piece is already one of the highest budget TV shows of all time. So it's already hitting the money ceiling and therefore the time ceiling. And as a result, there are a limited amount of episodes that can be produced per season, which means that brutal cuts need to be made. Cuts that have severe knock-on effects. And for this video, I'm focusing exclusively on the Baratie arc. Eiichiro Oda built the House of One Piece meticulously. Every character exists for a reason, even if you don't consciously pick up on it. And they exist usually to inform or build the characters that we are consciously aware of. These are what I'm going to refer to as building block characters, and they come in an assortment of roles, but each of them serves a necessary purpose. However, when it comes to the restrictions of time, these are the first characters to be cut, meaning that we end up losing a lot of our building blocks and the structure starts to become quite unsound. And the first block to examine is a good old slab of Lieutenant Iron Fist Full Body, someone who I never thought I would miss, and I don't really, but what I do miss is Full Body's impact on everyone else. Full Body is the first character we meet in the manga for the Baratie arc. The Straw Hats come across a Navy vessel and then have some words with a very arrogant Full Body who promises to let them go because it's his day off, and he has a bit of a hot date at Baratie with Moody. But as soon as he's out of earshot, Full Body orders his men to fire on the Going Merry, and this tells us everything we need to know about him, which is that even though he puts on this show of bravado, he's a fraud. And you can't trust a single thing he says. Which transitions quite nicely into his meal at Baratie, where he's describing the flavors of the wine and everyone's all super impressed, until Sanji says that absolutely nothing he said so far has been correct. And as a reader, this is incredibly satisfying, because we've already seen this guy betray our crew and establish himself as an antagonistic presence. He was a prick to us, so seeing him humiliated is a great shot of Schadenfreude right to the veins. And Full Body's actions from this point on make a lot of sense. We've established that he has such a fragile ego that of course he's going to try and humiliate Sanji, which is why he puts the fly in the soup. That fly's name is Bachi, by the way. And when that doesn't work, Full Body resorts to violence, and that doesn't end well. But my god, is it satisfying to watch. Because again, he'd already crossed us. He's the reason why the Straw Hats have a problem on Baratie at all. Now in the live action, Full Body does exist for all of 45 seconds. He appears in Baratie, and he's having an argument with a character that most One Piece fans won't recognize. But this is Crescent Moon Galley, the antagonist for the prototype of One Piece Romance Dawn version 1. He also appears in the actual series after Whole Cake Island, but this is the sort of thing that live action actually does really well, which is taking these historical One Piece treasures and sprinkling them in for our viewing pleasures. But what this incident boils down to is that Galley is upset because Full Body took his table. Now whether that actually happened or not, we don't know, but a fight breaks out, and this is used as an opportunity to showcase Sanji, who promptly beats the two of them up, and we move on. We never see him again. So we took a character who in 12 pages of manga has a fully fleshed out character arc, as well as an extremely satisfying conclusion, and we had to water that down to 45 seconds of essentially angry man gets into a fight. In fact, I would argue that we learn more about Galley, the Easter egg character, than we do about Full Body, the actual series character. Because Galley is the one instigating the situation, he gets the majority of the dialogue, and he is the overall more memorable presence. And I do think it's a slight concern when the Easter egg characters are being given more substance than the ones Oda created as building blocks to tell very specific aspects of his story. I'm not saying that Full Body himself is the make or break of live action One Piece, and it is nice to have his character arc in the manga, because stuff like that is a huge part of what makes One Piece feel like a living, breathing world. That these minor characters get to have these full short stories. But look, it was never about Full Body. Again, he himself is a building block. It's all about the effects that Full Body had on our main characters, which is significantly greater than you may remember. For one, in the live action, we don't even know that Full Body's a Marine, which is a big deal, because it sets up the Baratie is a no-nonsense establishment, and it shows just how serious Sanji is about food. Sanji only fights Full Body because he wasted soup, and the fact that Sanji is willing to openly attack a Marine officer for this transgression shows that he's willing to stand against the entire world for this belief. So even something as simple as not knowing that Full Body's a Marine has a serious impact on how we view Sanji, because from the live action perspective, he's just beating up some dude. But more importantly, Full Body is also the reason why Luffy became a chore boy at the restaurant. Luffy was defending his ship from Full Body's attack and accidentally damaged not only Baratie, but also Zeph himself as a result, which is why Luffy becomes a chore boy for a year. And because we had to reduce Full Body's role in the live action, Luffy now needs another reason to get into this major plot point. So what happens is that Luffy tries to pay for a meal with his quote treasure tab, and then gets conscripted into a year's worth of chores to pay it off, which still still works, but subjectively doesn't really work that well for me. In the manga, Luffy ends up in this position because he takes responsibility for his actions. He doesn't say that it was the Marine's fault. He doesn't try to weasel his way out of it. He just accepts it and rolls with it. Whereas in the live action, Luffy ends up in this position because he's a moron, and Zeph drags Luffy into the kitchen like a child into a principal's office. And even though Luffy is a child at heart, one of these stories tells us a lot more about who Luffy is deep down, which is a straightforward, honorable, lovable goofball, whereas the other one makes him look like an untrustworthy child. Quite literally, because the camera angle even looks down on him, making Luffy look like a cheeky child in a classroom. And the missing ingredient in these two portrayals, weirdly enough, is full body. The reduction of an already minor character led to these drastically different outcomes. One Piece is a structure. Individual components of the structure don't seem important out of context. Like, you don't look at a brick and go, huh, that's the house. Full body was a minor component who contributed to a huge effect. And that's just a minor character. What happens when we remove or reduce major characters? Funnily enough, another weird effect of reducing full body is the introduction of Gin, a medium-sized building block. Because Gin was originally a prisoner aboard full body ship who escapes and then starts causing trouble at Baratier. You know, thinking about it, without full body, Baratier would have been quite a pleasant side trip. But Gin is treated like utter garbage the moment he steps into the restaurant. Because he has no money, he's beaten up, called all sorts of assorted names like scum and the more scum, and then he's thrown out. And it tells us so much about Sanji that Gin is the person he chooses to feed. The other chefs at Baratier served full body because he had the money, even if there was no appreciation for the food. Whereas Gin had no money, but in his starving state, he understands the value of food on the same level as Sanji. And that's why Sanji decides to feed him, and Gin breaks down crying at the gesture. This is the other side of the full body coin, and it continues to tell us everything we need to know about Sanji. Within these two interactions, we have a precise understanding of Sanji's moral compass. Two interactions that are missing from the live action, and therefore not really giving us what we need with Sanji. And Gin is another character who is heavily reduced in the live action. He appears out of nowhere in the back of the kitchen of the restaurant and says 6 words. Please help me, I'm so hungry. And Sanji, of course, obliges. He cooks for Gin despite having been told by Zeph that he can't do any of the cooking, and that does give us some insight into who Sanji is, but it feels significantly watered down. Without seeing everyone else treat Gin like complete scum, Sanji treating Gin like a human loses a lot of its oomph. And without having seen full body's outright disregard for the value of food, Gin's appreciation of Sanji's gesture loses the bulk of its impact as well, which leaves Sanji himself very simmered down, having lost 2 of his key character moments in this arc. Not to mention that the entire scene feels very convenient. The fact that Gin comes knocking at just the right time, he also appears out of nowhere. I mean, Gin says that he was drifting for a week after being the only survivor of Mihawk's attack in the Grand Line, and yet somehow Gin got to Baratier before Mihawk did. Now, in fairness to the live action, Gin never says that he was part of Don Krieg's crew, and I think for the only way for this to make sense timeline-wise is to assume that he wasn't, because Garp appears to call Mihawk, who's fighting the Krieg pirates, on the same day that the Straw Hats reach Baratier, and Gin gets there that evening despite stating that he was adrift for a week. Feels a lot like trying to put a puzzle together, but we only have half the pieces. We need to build the same structure, but we're missing half the materials. Getting rid of all the full body build-up means that we don't have a core understanding of Sanji's food philosophy. We also don't have a way of getting Gin to Baratier, or a decent reason for Luffy to become a chore boy. Now, you might say that Gin, he doesn't need a great reason to get there because he disappears after this moment. He's another one and done, and fair enough, but that is also a pretty big issue. Again, it's not about Gin himself. It's about Gin's impact on Sanji. Gin is a tool for us to get to Sanji's arc development. Much like Sanji, Gin is a man trapped by obligation. Despite his wishes to leave the Krieg pirates, he has a fierce loyalty to Don Krieg himself, which is what Gin needs to overcome over the course of the Battle of Baratier. And Sanji watches as Gin struggles to choose between Krieg and Sanji himself, the man who saved his life. And in the end, Gin makes the decision to live for himself, even if that life won't be particularly long due to all of the poison it is that he inhaled. Gin is a mirror to Sanji. Sanji feels indebted to Zeph for saving his life. And in the same way that Gin feels like he needs to attack Baratier for Krieg, Sanji feels obliged to stay at the restaurant and continue to defend it for Zeph. So seeing Gin overcome this is a big step in Sanji's own personal development. Gin chose a short but free life over a long and trapped life. He teaches Sanji the value of pursuing your own dreams and desires, which is a big part of Sanji deciding to depart with Luffy to go and find the All Blue. And in the absence of all of that, I'm not sure where Sanji gets this motivation from in the live action. So at one point, Luffy does say, "Don't let some stubborn old man get in the way of your dream." And the thing that appears to push Sanji over the edge is Zeph saying, "Quitting is staying saying here. It's one thing to have a dream, it's another to go after it. Which is actually a great line, I like it a lot, but those two lines are not enough. It's a very boring and overused phrase, but actions speak louder than words, and in the ironically named live action, there are no actions that inform Sanji's decision, only words. He's not there for the Zoro versus Mihawk fight, which he did witness in the manga, and much like he did with Gin, what happened here was Sanji witnessing a man prepared to die to follow his desires. But he doesn't get that in the live action. In the manga, Sanji also witnesses Luffy prepared to die to take down Don Krieg, and in fact he would have died if Sanji had not stepped in, and this was the turning point for Sanji because at that stage he'd witnessed 3 people who all value freedom and desire above a long life. Gin, Zoro, and Luffy, each of the 3 going on to inspire Sanji to make his decision. These are the 3 pushes that get Sanji out of the door of Baratie, and in the live action he doesn't get any pushes. After his one scene, Gin is non-existent, Sanji isn't present for the Mihawk fight, which I can't explain. I don't know why they left both he and Zeph out of it, and because Don Krieg gets removed, Sanji is robbed of that moment of seeing Luffy succeed and reinforcing that he was the right man to follow out of this restaurant. I've said this before, but the live action has a line that always makes me laugh. It's in episode 6 when Zeph and Sanji are having their discussion and Sanji just spits out, "Yeah, well, the chore boy offered me a spot on his crew, so maybe I'm gonna do that." And whilst this does make me laugh each and every time, I also feel a sense of pain because this is very indicative of how live action Sanji thinks of live action Luffy. At this point in the series, Luffy has done nothing of worth in front of Sanji. He let his crewmate get slaughtered by Mihawk, his navigator betrayed him, Usopp got drunk at the bar, and Luffy himself got obliterated by Arlong. So of course Sanji still refers to him as the chore boy instead of Captain or even Luffy, because the only thing of substance that Sanji has seen from Luffy in the live action is washing dishes. So as a result, in the live action, it feels more like Sanji leaves after having an argument with his dad and taking his first opportunity to sail away, rather than Luffy having to prove himself to Sanji, to earn Sanji calling him Captain instead of chore boy. So speaking of the whole chore boy thing, I know I've brought this up a lot as well, but we never found out how Luffy got out of being a chore boy. In the manga, it's because he makes a deal with Zeph that if he can defeat Don Krieg, then his debt will be forgiven, which again shows Luffy as quite an honorable, lovable goofball. He does wacky things and sometimes they turn out badly, and if so, you know what Luffy does? He makes them better. But the live action just forgets this is a thing. Despite the episode being called The Chef and The Chore Boy, and having both Sanji and Zeph refer to Luffy as the chore boy, we don't ever find out how Luffy gets away from being the chore boy in the entire episode. And it hits me because Luffy doesn't earn his way out of the problem that he caused. Which in the manga would be one thing because you can argue that it wasn't his fault. But in the live action, it is 100% his fault. It happens because he's an idiot and he gets out of it without doing anything. And whilst this isn't in the Baratie arc, it definitely makes me believe Garp in episode 8 when he says that Luffy isn't ready for the Grand Line. I agree with him. Live action Luffy is not ready. And that's the other issue with getting rid of Don Krieg, who was a very big chunky building block. He was such an important skill test for Luffy. Don Krieg is notorious in One Piece for being the guy who set sail into the Grand Line with big ambitions and then came running back after being decimated within days. Krieg isn't just another villain to be beaten. He is a non-optional step for Luffy. Because if Luffy can't defeat Don Krieg, then of course he's not ready for the Grand Line. Krieg's role largely involves him laughing at Luffy's dreams and even looking down on his teeny tiny crew and saying stuff like, "Don't be so cocksure, kid. I have a fleet and 5,000 men. In 7 days we were smashed to bits in that demon sea." This is the point in One Piece where Luffy has to prove not just to Sanji but to all of us that he's ready to take on this challenge by defeating the person who failed. And it's also the first real display in One Piece of willpower overcoming more traditional aspects of strength. Don Krieg has 5,000 men, a colossal arsenal of weapons, indestructible golden armor, chemical weapons, and even the home field advantage of fighting a devil fruit user at sea. And Luffy goes on to prove that all of that is secondary to the sheer drive to succeed, which is symbolized at the end by Luffy breaking Krieg's indestructible armor with nothing but his bare palms. Probably my favorite moment of Luffy versus Don Krieg is when he equips his spike cloak and Luffy just punches him anyway. That's the moment where I really started to believe in Luffy. And in the live action, honestly, there is no point where I believe in him. Even against Arlong at the very end, Luffy admits that he can't beat him, which is the exact opposite of what he says in the manga. In the manga, what he says is, "All I can do is beat you." And in the live action, he can't even do that. So again, the biggest problem with the live action is that it will always be restricted by time, which means that we need to cut integral building blocks from this world. And once we start to cut too many of them, the structure, it begins to collapse. In the Baratie arc alone, what Luffy gets out of this arc is built on Don Krieg, who is built on Gin, who is built on Full Body. And it's no surprise that if you remove all three of these building blocks, Luffy comes out of Baratie having built nothing. Similarly, Sanji is built on both Luffy and Gin. But without Gin and without a structure for Luffy, he falls down as well. And so what we get out of him is very surface level. I'm not saying that the live action was wrong to do things this way. I actually think they did the best they could, and they will continue to do the very best they can. I just personally don't think it's possible in the time they have. That's the enduring curse of live action, and I think it's only going to become more and more difficult to overcome in future seasons, but I wish them all the best, and I would love to be thoroughly proved wrong.